All right. So we have 4 panelists for this panel. These are all pretty serious issues going on in the region. Many of you are involved with them, so I think it's going to be pretty interesting stuff. We're trying to leave a half hour at the end for Q&A, because there's going to be a lot to talk about. So I'm asking each of the speakers to speak for 15 minutes. We're going to save all the questions till the end, and if we do it right, we'll have about a half an hour, so hopefully we will get there. Our first speaker is Chris Egan, and Chris is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Forest Alliance. MFA represents forest landowners, foresters, timber harvesters, and forest products companies in Massachusetts. Chris is a lawyer by training. He's got many years of experience working on legislative and regulatory matters, both at the state and federal level. He first became interested in forestry when he hired a consulting forester to develop a forest management plan and conducted timber harvests at the summer camp he was running in the Berkshires. Chris, you're up.
Great, thank you, Charlie. As Charlie said, we only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to move through this pretty quickly. Some of you are from Massachusetts and you lived through this, others haven't, so I thought it would be worth going over some of the history of opposition to forest management on state lands, which in Massachusetts is nothing new. It dates back decades at this point. And we've now seen sort of that sentiment spreading into other states in New England. And when this started, it really had nothing to do with climate change. They were focused on the silvicultural choices being made by the state and state forests and other lands. And, looking back, there were things that perhaps everybody could have done better, whether it's the state in terms of explaining what it was doing or defending that, whether it was our group that could have done more to stand up publicly. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So just going over some of the history, in the 1990s, there was a special commission on forest management practices addressing some of the concerns. In 1999, there was a Thinking in Forest Time publication from Harvard Forest that called for a forest vision in Massachusetts, and that actually took place the next year and came out with several recommendations. And the first was to put some state forest land in reserves, obtaining FSC certification on managed forest land the state was doing, and creating forest management plans, long-term forest management plans for state forest parcels, which hadn't really been done to that point. And then these recommendations were pushed out as a call to action by assorted groups. And I'm going to quickly touch on biomass power for the reason that biomass power in Massachusetts became a very controversial topic. When it did, it supercharged opposition to forest management on state lands. The two things sort of worked together. So every time we had, a discussion about biomass power, that tended to elevate the discussion about forest management on state lands. And so the two things together were a real issue. So we saw some of that starting in the mid-2000s when the state had some goals that included biomass power, and all the way up to a period of 2009 to 2012. So all this led up to this forest futures visioning process as opposition grew and biomass power issues grew, sort of the second visioning. And so the DCR, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, which manages state forests, they have a stewardship council, but DCR does a lot of things. They own roadways, they run pools and hockey rinks and golf courses. They have state parks. So the members of this council were largely recreation-based at the time, and they were getting hammered at their public meetings on forestry issues. And so they really had no knowledge or experience or knew what to do. So eventually they threw up their hands and they called for a moratorium on forest management on DCR lands, and a committee put together. So that took place. There was a technical steering committee formed and an advisory group of stakeholders in the 2009-2010 timeframe. And they came out with some recommendations. And the first was to divide those DCR lands into 3 categories: parklands, which were heavily recreation areas; woodlands, where forest management would take place; and reserves, which were off limits to management. And some forest land had already been put in reserve, so they said, we want to increase the percentage of reserves. And they made a bunch of other recommendations. Essentially, they retitled the state forester as the director of forest stewardship, improving public process around forest management projects, looking more at ecosystem services, a holistic view. And so that was turned over to DCR, and in 2011 to 12, they undertook these landscape designations. And so when the final designations came out, 25% of their lands were in parklands, 36% in reserves, and a little over 39, 40% in woodlands. Now this affected only DCR lands. There are two other groups that own state forest land. One is the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, commonly known as Mass Wildlife, and the other is the Division of Water Supply Protection, which handles watershed forestry around the Quabbin Reservoir and some other watersheds. And they were not affected. So why was that? Well, they had strong boards. Unlike the DCR Stewardship Council, they had strong boards that were very knowledgeable and experienced about what they were doing. They were able to stand up and push back on their management and defend it, and so this did not apply to them. The other thing that came out of this whole visioning process was that there was a feeling on the part of the forestry community that we got rolled and that there were issues. So there were different small groups, none of which had a lot of power. The groups were not necessarily aligned from group to group, and in fact there was division within the groups themselves. So the feeling was that we needed to create sort of one voice for forestry in Massachusetts. So three different groups merged. It's a little complicated because they all had very different names over the years. But there was a landowner group, a logger sawmill group, and a forester group that all came together to form the alliance. And by doing so, they created that one voice, and they also together had enough resources that they could hire a full-time executive director, which is the job that I'm currently in. And then after this whole process, after all of this, there was a period of relative peace after 2012. Things were still bubbling up. Now climate change became more of an issue. And just to be clear, climate change had been a part of this, but it became more and more of a prominent component going forward. In fact, Bill Moomaw, the sort of father of pro-forestation, had been on that technical steering committee in 2009 and really had been deferred to on that committee quite a bit, which is a similar thing to what happened recently. But pro-forestation, sort of the first journal article published about it was in 2019, and this led to sort of this big anti-forest management pushback, sort of a rekindling of all this opposition. So, you know, late 2018, 2019 is when a lot of these things hit, which is right about the time I started. And there were protests and legislative stuff happening. So just quickly on the protest, Wendell State Forest, you may have been familiar with this. This all happened in 2019. DCR was doing a forest management project. There were three different components. There was a tornado that came through, created some early successional forest habitat. Mass Wildlife asked DCR to enlarge it by cutting in a white pine plantation. There was a red pine plantation that had been devastated by the red pine scale, so they were cutting that back. And then finally, they were harvesting some trees in a red oak dominated area, really for the purpose of encouraging regeneration, creating age class diversity, vertical structure, et cetera. And it was really only the last one that was opposed for climate change reasons. You know, and my question was, well, don't the pine trees contain carbon? You know, but there was really no opposition to those facets of this. So I think part of this was that there was no record of forest management on that land since those trees had started growing about 100 years earlier. So they called them centurion oaks, these 100-year-old oak trees. And they said that a 100-year-old oak tree stand was an incredibly rare ecosystem in Massachusetts. Now, you know, so they did various things. They blocked the woods roads so that the logging trucks couldn't get to the landings. They chained themselves to equipment. They actually approached a live active harvest area, so they literally went up and grabbed a tree as a feller buncher was cutting it down. Just incredibly dangerous stuff. They had a funeral for the trees, and they had a procession with a coffin that was made out of cardboard. They just completely missed the irony there. So that went on and was a big deal. And then also in 2019, we had a bill filed that would put all state forest land into reserve. So even the agencies that were not part of this. So essentially banning management on state-owned forest land. Now, the good thing that happened was we had a coalition come together to oppose this, and it included major environmental organizations. So here are the folks that were part of this, and it includes some big names like the Nature Conservancy, Mass Audubon, ELM, Trustees, Harvard Forest. Those were all very powerful groups in Massachusetts. And they were standing up for forest management on state lands. All these groups believe that there should be a mix of reserves and actively managed lands. So that was very helpful. When legislators learned that these groups opposed the bill, they quickly backed off. We were able to kill it, and it's been refiled every session since. So last session, we were able to kill it. This session, it removes mass wildlife from the bill, largely because that was very unpopular. But we're hoping to kill it again. It is, the committee's supposed to make a decision on whether to advance it or not on April 12th. And then if all this wasn't enough, in 2019, they also had the return of biomass power issues. The state had essentially regulatorily banned it by this artificially high efficiency standard that the plants couldn't meet. But the Department of Energy Resources proposed waiving that standard if you use non-forest derived wood, so tree service wood, DPW wood, utility line clearings, et cetera. And there's about 3 million tons of that material made in Massachusetts every year. So the real point of this was to support a plant in Springfield, horribly sited. It was being built across the street from a low-income neighborhood, caused a lot of controversy, but all this helped supercharge this opposition to forest management. In 2022, these environmental groups issued a briefing book for statewide candidates where they called for a continuation of forest management on state lands. But Governor Healy, in her campaign platform, proposed a moratorium, a committee to study and make guidelines and changes and to increase the amount of reserves. And she did that, there's some feeling that because activists were able to get this into the Democratic State Party platform. We're not really involved in party politics, so we didn't realize this was happening until it already took place. But the official position of the Democratic Party in Massachusetts was to ban forest management on state lands. So one of the things that happened after Healy was elected was the DCR pulled back their 2022 forest management projects in November, really before Healy took office. They allowed projects that were already awarded to proceed because otherwise they'd be, liable for breach of contract. But no new projects have been put out since late 2022. Some of the environmental groups, the Nature Conservancy, Mass Audubon, and the trustees wrote an open letter to Governor Healy in December calling for a continuation of forest management on state lands. And then there was a climate forestry committee put together in June of last year, and they were asked to complete a report by December. It was sort of a very rushed process. And the committee included people like Bill Mumma, who very strongly opposed management in any circumstances, and then foresters and experienced folks who supported management. They were supposed to reach consensus. They couldn't really do that. The report was issued a month late. There were some things that they recommended. We didn't necessarily agree with that report, and we submitted a lot, some voluminous comments about that. So it was, I think part of it was the report was written in such a way to lead people to believe it was very anti-management, when in fact it was more of a mixed bag. When the report came out, the moratorium was officially lifted. However, projects are not being put out to bid yet. And what they're waiting for is for the EEA, the Energy and Environmental Affairs Secretariat, which is the level above DCR and those other agencies, to respond to the report, decide how they're going to implement those recommendations. It was supposed to come out in February. Now it's supposed to come out in March. Still hasn't come out. It remains to be seen when that will happen. So that's sort of where we stand with forest management on state lands. There's other things underway. There's a forest carbon study that's looking to 2100. Previously, the state only looked at 2050, which gives you sort of a distorted picture of forestry and long-term thinking. We have some folks on that committee. There's things we're very concerned about. There's proposals to implement environmental impact reports for forestry projects over 50 acres in harvest size. Those reports can run to hundreds of pages and cost, 5 figures to produce. So that would be devastating to forest management in Massachusetts if it happened. The state is also doing some things. There's a climate stewardship incentive program, similar to NRCS, that pays for some climate smart forest practices. There's a program for loggers that will cost share timber mat and bridges that's coming soon. You know, we have some concerns about regulatory creep there. They just held an event to sort of celebrate forestry and forest management projects last week. That was a sold-out crowd. It was called Canopy. It's going to become an annual event, and that was good to see that the state was actually supporting forestry and forest management. And there's other industry support programs that the state is going to roll out. We've been talking with them about that. There's things to incentivize the use of local wood and some other things that are being discussed. And so those will roll out over the next year. So that's sort of where we're at in Massachusetts. It's not a great situation. There's a few positive things, but we're working hard to push back on things as we go forward. Thank you.
Whose computer is this? No, I'm just, there it is. The mouse is hiding in the wall. All right. Okay. Next up is Jay Strand from the Green Mountain National Forest. Jay is the environmental coordinator and forest planner for the Green Mountain and Finger Lakes National Forest. He's held forester and silviculture positions on national forests in Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, and Minnesota. He moved to Vermont in 1997 to coordinate the environmental impact statement for the Loon Mountain ski resort expansion project located in New Hampshire before accepting his current position. His primary role is to ensure all Forest Service management activities comply with the Green Mountain National Forest Land and Resource Management Plan and all the relative federal laws, regulations, and policies. He's going to be talking about the telephone gap project. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks, Charlie. Okay. Clicker.
You can do that, or you can just use the advanced buttons.
Which is the arrows.
This one?
Yeah. Nothing's happening. Is it this one?
There you go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Charlie. I appreciate that introduction. I just have to share really quickly, you know, I did practice forestry and silviculture in my past life. I had to switch roles to get back to my wife's beloved Vermont. I think you all can understand that. So I sort of had to give up my career in forestry, but I still keep in touch through my current role because I work with a lot of foresters and silviculturists on our forests. So that's the good thing. Anyway, you probably may have heard about the Telephone Gap Project, and it has gotten a lot of attention over the course of the last few years, especially in the news media here in Vermont. You may have even heard about it outside of Vermont, and you may be wondering why. So I'm going to try and explain and provide the context. Get closer to this. That's all right. Can you all hear me okay? All right. So I thought I'd start quickly and just talk about our forest plan. The Land and Resource Management Plan is important for where'd those arrows go? For you to understand that it was completed in 2006, so we've been operating under this plan for quite some time now. It guides all of our management activities on national forest lands in Vermont. It provides our goals, objectives, and desired conditions that we're trying to achieve across the landscape. It emphasizes multiple resource uses. There's 17 management areas that are described in the forest plan, and basically it's like a town zoning plan. It tells us what we can and can't do on certain parts of the national forest. It's important to point out at this part of my presentation that the forest plan is a programmatic document. It doesn't approve anything. It doesn't authorize anything. It just provides us guidance on what we can do on the national forests in Vermont. It has goals and objectives, and the goals and objectives are there for us to achieve on the landscape through our management practices. The goals and objectives related directly to timber harvesting really has a lot to do with maintaining and restoring habitat to provide for a diversity of plant and wildlife species. That's it in a nutshell. And we have composition and age class objectives that we try to achieve across the landscape to provide that important habitat. And the primary means, or the tool that we do that with, of course, is through timber harvesting. And of course, the byproduct or the other part or the other goal and objective that we achieve by doing so is providing wood products to help the local and regional woods industry economy. So I thought this would be a good time to pop up this slide. It just shows a history of the timber that's been sold from Green Mountain National Forest timber harvest activities going all the way back to 1989. You can see in the late 90s that we hovered around between 6 and 8 million board feet on an annual basis, and then took a deep dive in the early 2000s, mainly due to a self-imposed moratorium on timber harvesting due to the Indiana bat issue. It became endangered. We had to amend our forest plan, so we shut down timber harvesting activities for that period of time. Then when the current forest plan was revised in 2006, the timber program began to ramp back up. And as you can see, since 2006, it's steadily increased up until right about now. I would say we're hovering between 10 and 12 million board feet on an average basis as far as what we're selling. So I just wanted to really talk about the National Environmental Policy Act very quickly because it's important for everybody to understand as a federal land management agency, we have to follow this law. So like I mentioned, the forest plan is a programmatic document. It doesn't authorize or approve anything. So everything that we do on the landscape in order for us to be able to implement on the ground has to go through the NEPA process. And all that simply means, is that we have to disclose the environmental impacts or effects from our activities, and we have to involve the public, and we have to, and it's a good thing to do, ask for their input. This is all used as a basis for the responsible official to decide what to do on the ground based on that environmental analysis process. Wrong way. So quickly, what's an integrated resource project? To give you some context, it's a self-described term that we gave to the simple planning and implementation of project activities within a similar geographic area on the National Forest in Vermont. So we basically, as resource specialists, pool our time and interest, focus in on bridging the gap between existing and forest plan desired conditions. We've completed 6 IRPs or integrated resource projects since 2006. And it takes about a 3 or 4 year time period or process to go from the planning, the analysis, and actual decision and implementation. But it's a really efficient process because it pools, like I said, our resource time together to be able to have a pretty good output at the decision phase of the project. So in terms of timber harvesting, on the average, out of those 6 IRPs, we've authorized or approved about 8,200 acres of harvest. It depends on the area. How much of that is uneven age is between 30 to 60% uneven age harvest methods, individual tree selection and group selection. The remaining being, of course, even aged. Most of that is shelter wood or thinning. And a very small, you'd be surprised, small amount of that is clear cutting, if you hear the news, because it sounds like we're going to be clear cutting 12,000 acres with telephone gap. We only approve or authorize about 215 acres on the average from our IRPs. So bringing it down specific to the telephone gap project area, for those of you who are not familiar where it's located, it's in the south central western part of Vermont, just north of Rutland. You can see right there, smack in the middle of that water body is Chittenden Reservoir. The lower boundary is US Highway 4, and Vermont 100 is basically the eastern boundary, just to give you a perspective of where it's located. It's about 72,000 acres in size. Just under half of that is actual national forest lands. That's the colored parts of the project area that you see within the bold black boundary of the project area. And the remaining part of the project area is private and state and town lands, most of it being private. we're not proposing any activities on non-national forest lands. It's very important to point that out. But we include the overall project area because of its sub-watershed capacity, and we have to disclose and consider cumulative effects within that project boundary because NEPA requires us to look at the big picture. So what's different about Telephone Gap? What's the big deal? Well, as far as what we're proposing, absolutely nothing. There's nothing different compared to what we've been doing in the past because we're proposing to harvest exactly what we've been doing over the past 15 years. 8,200 acres is what we're proposing to harvest. 47% of that is uneven aged, a little bit higher than the average on clear cutting, but not a whole lot, about 330 acres. So what's different? The socio-political climate has shifted drastically right underneath our feet in the last couple of years, fast. It's hard to keep up with it all. And so what I mean by that, on the social end of things, the public interest has really shifted and focused in on climate change. It's a crisis. How do we solve that? Don't cut mature and old forests. They store carbon. That's the shift. That's the perception. There's a huge emphasis, as mentioned earlier in the previous presentation, pro-forestation, primarily on public lands. Do not cut trees. Those trees are more important as carbon reserves to mitigate climate change. A publication came out in July of 2022 called Workforce Standing. It was put together, it's a very slick publication. It was put together by a consortium of environmental organizations at the national level, highlighting the 10 worst logging projects on federal lands in the United States. Telephone Gap was listed as one of those projects. So that's why it got a lot of attention, especially higher up in the Forest Service. It got a lot of attention, even as high up as from the Chief of the Forest Service and the Secretary of Agriculture. Forgot to talk about the political side of things. The Council on Environmental Quality issued guidance in 2023 of January on how to conduct effects analysis and disclose effects specific to climate change and carbon emissions from both fossil fuel projects and vegetative management projects. And then about the same time, April 2022, the President issued an executive order emphasizing the need to conserve mature and old-growth forests on Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service lands nationally, and ordered and talked about needing to do an inventory of where those resources exist. So the Telephone Gap project, at the end of the day, is what we're proposing, is about 57.6 CCF of wood products for 36 million board feet. And the side benefits there, if you want to call them side benefits, are to enhance forest health and diversity and improve wildlife habitat, among other things that have nothing to do with the timber harvesting. The public input, we invited comments back in January. We received 1,600 comments. They helped us develop alternatives and focus our environmental analysis, which is in our environmental assessment, which we just rolled out for our 30-day comment review on March 8th. So we have a comment period going on right now. And the primary issue you might have guessed is the harvest of mature and old forests. They're going to reduce carbon. We're going to reduce carbon storage, increase carbon emissions, reduce biodiversity, and we're not in alignment with that executive order. So we developed an alternative to directly address that. We've deferred 600 acres or more that we're saying have late successional attributes. Another tier, we're changing or modifying our harvest methods to enhance the late successional attributes within those stands. And then we're retaining some more of the traditional harvest. That alternative reduces harvest acres by about 11% and volume by 17%. So the highlight is, in the analysis itself, the EA, the environmental assessment, is sort of an educational tool for us to show that we're putting the pencil to the paper on climate-smart silviculture. We're defining and putting the nuanced definitions in there between economic and ecological mature forest, the definitions there. There's a big difference. And we also use it as a great tool or way to disclose the effects associated with harvesting timber in terms of the carbon that's emitted directly into the atmosphere. To my knowledge, this is the first environmental assessment in the Forest Service, not nationwide, that's attempted to do that. At the end of the day, you'll look in the effects analysis and show that a direct effect of harvesting timber at the forest level, at the stand level, that we're projecting or estimating about 171,000 metric tons of carbon to be emitted into the atmosphere. To put that into context, that's over 15 years period of the implementation of the project. Break it down into an annual output, that's about 11,500 metric tons, and that equates to about 2,700 passenger vehicles operating on the roads and emitting carbon. So where do we go from here? We're going to complete the analysis. We're going to roll the final environmental assessment out in June. It kicks off an objection period. The Forest Service has an administrative review objection process. Depending on how that goes, and we will get objected, I guarantee. And based on or depending on how the objection review goes, we'll sign a final decision notice and be able to implement hopefully by the end of this year or early 2025. So why should you care? What's the take-home message here, which is what I was directed to actually put into my presentation. What does that mean to you guys? It's really interesting to note, I think, what we've learned is the extreme change in public values and perceptions, okay? And so climate change is at a crisis level. That's not a perception, that's a reality. But what are we gonna do about it? Again, pro-forestation, primarily on public lands. Don't cut trees, don't cut old growth by any means whatsoever. And keep your hands off that mature forest too. So what does that mean as far as wood products? There's this perception that it all can be taken care of by private lands. Public lands don't mean anything as far as providing wood products, never mind all the other benefits that I talked about as a result of that timber harvesting activity on the national forest. The potential changes in national and state policy is a real thing based on these changed public perceptions. They influence our legislators. It's already happening at the national level, the executive order that I already talked about, and as we speak, there's an effort to amend every single national forest plan, including on the Green Mountain National Forest, to ensure that we're protecting not only old growth forest, but recruitment of stands for future old growth forests. And we're still not quite sure what that's gonna mean to us here in Vermont. Last but not least, there is a tremendous amount of misinformation being spread around out there, mainly by environmental organizations who are basically against what we're trying to do on the landscape, but the news media holds on to that. They grab onto the big headline catchers that indicate conflict. They love it. And it's very, very important to counteract that. And it's very difficult to catch up to the train that's left the station. So that's it. Good.
Thank you, Jay. Next up is Danny Fitzko. And before Danny comes up, I understand that Zach Porter, who is the executive director of Standing Trees, one of the organizations that has been commenting on what's going on the green and also on state lands here in Vermont. I understand he came to this meeting. Zach, are you in the room? Hi, Zach. Everybody, you should have a conversation with Zach. He came. We're welcoming to folks who are non-members. We always have been as an organization, and thank you for coming. So now we know where you are, and hopefully people will buttonhole you. And if you want, I'd love to have lunch with you today. Great, thank you. Danny's going to talk about Camel's Hump State Forest. Danny Fitzko is the commissioner for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Her journey with the department includes over 15 years as the Urban and Community Forestry Program Manager, followed by a tenure as the Director of Forest. Danny finds joy in tending to her garden, embarking on woodland explorations. I want to know what that's all about. And rejuvenation through yoga. Danny.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. And I kind of wish that I wasn't here to talk about a situation, but I think it's the reality that we do have a situation in Vermont, and it's kind of comforting that to hear, being the third person in line here, that we're not alone. When Charlie reached out to me on Monday and said, Danny, I need your PowerPoint, and I said, Charlie, I'm going old school, so I do not have a PowerPoint for you. You have one picture to look at. And this way, you can not have to look at me the whole time. I know the title of my talk is Camel's Hump State Forest Situation, but I want to start off right from the bat that this is no longer just a Camel's Hump State Forest situation. I'd like to retitle this as the Vermont State Lands Situation. As you know, we have advocacy groups out there that are pushing messages. You've heard it, and I will quote, "We face a climate crisis, biodiversity collapse, and we must protect our public lands and let them grow." They go further on to say that with nearly 90% of New England forests available for timber harvest, very few will ever get the chance to grow old unless we permanently manage public forests as wildlands. Compared to forests managed for wood products, old and wild forests are more resilient to changes in the climate, support the greatest levels of biodiversity, store more carbon, reduce sediment and nutrient pollutions in water bodies, and protect communities from the impacts of extreme participation events. Let's face it, most people do not have the knowledge that you have in this room. All of you can go in depth to tell them that there's so much more to the story. You know that. But this clickbait, simple message, we must protect our public lands and let forests grow, is getting clicks. That's our greatest challenge, is to change the message and tell our story. And we need to make it simple. So far in Vermont, we've been sued to stop timber harvesting in Camel's Hump Management Unit. And during the most recent public comment period for the Worcester Range Management Unit Long Range Management Plan, we've been called to keep the Worcester Range wild and stop all logging. You know, in Vermont, we have been so fortunate to have policies that entrust to the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation to manage and plan for state forests, to promote and protect natural resources to be productive and for the recreation values, and to provide for the multiple uses. We are being called out that we're not acting in the public's interest. This couldn't be further from the truth. We all work so hard as public agencies to consider the multiple values and benefits that our forests and our state lands provide. We go through such a robust public process with state assessments, public scoping to hear the opinions of Vermonters. We draft a plan considering all those benefits and values, and then we ask again for public input. You all know how long it takes us to go through that process, and we do it so thoughtfully and so carefully because we care deeply about the lands and we care deeply about our service to the public. And when we're doing that, we're really trying to strike what I keep thinking of as a really delicate balance to get it right for now and for the future. I thought I'd just give you a little understanding of like what is the Vermont state lands made up of. We have about 370,000 acres that are state lands. That's about 8% of the Vermont landscape. The Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation oversees about 240,000 acres. Department of Fish and Wildlife, 135,000 acres. and Department of Environmental Conservation for dam-owned lands, a little under 2,000 acres. What I love about what Vermont does is the way we approach our planning and management of state lands. This is what the headlines should be, is that we do it as a team, that we have a multidisciplinary approach. In each of our 5 districts across the state, we have professionals that come together with expertise in wildlife, in fisheries, in forestry, in forest health, in recreation, in ecology, in watershed planning. They come together for really tough conversations, and they make the best decisions that based on the scientific and what they've heard from the public, decisions for public lands. I'm really proud of the way we do it, and I think it's a model, and I think it's something we should be celebrating. Our foresters within the Department of FPR, they do all the forest management across all agency lands, so the 370,000 acres. When we approach our management on state lands, we are always looking at the future forest. We want healthy forests, resilient forests, complex forests. All those list of items in the beginning, carbon sequestration, carbon storage, wildlife habitat, healthy ecosystems, clean air, clean water, all part of the consideration going forward. In addition, we do consider forest products, economic opportunity, recreation, how do we connect people, all about today and for the future. We are not driven by markets in Vermont on state lands, which is great that we don't have to worry about that. This allows us the opportunity to really push the envelope on being places where we can try new things. We have several projects across state lands where we're working with UVM and the Forest Service to really try out new practices for adaptive silviculture. We can be the testing grounds. We are demonstration areas. We are models for exemplary forestry management. People should be coming to state lands to look at what we're doing and celebrate what we're doing and learn from that and take it back to their private lots and on other public lands like municipal forests. But even with all the thoughtful and good work that we're doing, timber harvests on state lands are being challenged. I wanted to just give you an understanding of really what the scale is of what kind of management we're doing here in Vermont. First, I want to just share that for all those acres that we're managing, we only have 19 staff. 19 staff on state lands that not only do forest management, but doing all the long-range management planning process, we're doing all the recreation, and we have lots of pressures there that we have to meet. We have 600 miles of roads that we're managing. We have a lot of public inquiries that we're responding to on a daily basis, and then somewhere down the line, we're able to get to forest management. In the past few years, we've managed about 400 acres a year. Due to a lot of times it could be weather challenges, other priorities, or we're being sidetracked for what we've called it, the situation. So let me tell you about what happened with Camel's Hump, since that is the title I was given. I'll give you the storyline in Camel's Hump, but I'm going to tell you right up front, I am the furthest thing from a lawyer, so don't go too deep with me, because I don't sure I can answer all the questions. So it started back in October 2021. Camel's Hump Management Plan was signed. This was years in the making. We had over 700 comments that came in, which is great. We love public comments. We want to hear from the public. A lot of those are form comments. We had 700 come in for the Worcester Range, and we also had around 700 come in from Mount Philo, which is really more of a recreational higher use area. During that time in 2021, we didn't see as much of an outcry against forest management. It was more about more or less recreation. Camel's Hump is a little over 26,000 acre parcel. In that plan, almost 4,000 acres were identified as opportunities for forest management over the next 15 years, with 65% of the parcel set aside in land classifications that would be more passively managed. That's about the size of Waitsfield, Vermont, for those that know Vermont's communities. So October 2021, we have our plan. January 2022 was our first FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act. Public servants here understand what a challenge it is to respond to all the FOIA requests. This one was huge, over 10,000 documents. So when I talk about we're being sidetracked with other situations, can imagine the time and effort it took for staff to go through the paper files, to go through the digital files, to go through the emails, for 10,000 documents, and then sit and watch people go through those documents. We're not getting to forest management, other management on the land, because we're being sidetracked with FOIA requests. That was just one of many more to come. In June of 2022, we received a petition signed by around 35 people to enter into rulemaking for state lands within the next 30 days and to halt all timber harvests until we go through that rulemaking process. In July of 2022, a month later, we responded and said, we will go through rulemaking on our own timeline, and we will not stop timber harvesting. I just want to share that the rulemaking decision was not something that was prompted by this petition. We have been working on updating our long-range management planning process for years. We know we need to do a better job of being quicker at it, because we have a lot in the queue, without losing our robust scientific planning process. We felt like rulemaking would actually assist us in being more effective in our planning process, so we are already on that trajectory. In November of 2022, we were sued on 3 counts: to go into rulemaking because it's in statute, that we were not following the Global Warming Solutions Act that calls for all agencies and programs to look at the greenhouse gas emissions, and that we didn't follow the petition to go into rulemaking. Between November 2022 and September 23, there were lots of back and forth. We filed a motion to dismiss, then they respond, then we respond, then they respond, back and forth between the lawyers and our staff. So we're in litigation for about a year, and I'll be honest, that's a wet blanket for our team. It is really heavy. The work that we're doing thoughtfully is being challenged. At the same time, we did not stop our planning for state lands management or any implementation on the Camel's Hump Management Unit. September 2023, we heard from the court that it was dismissed due to not having standing. And standing just means you need to have, in order to bring a lawsuit, a person must be injured or have a personal stake in the outcome of the lawsuit. That was challenged, came back in favor of the state. Now, in November 2023, we have our first timber sale in Camel's Hump Management Unit in Duxbury. Same time, November 2023, we announced the opening of the comment period for the Worcester Range Management Unit. Now our focus has shifted to the Wild Worcester Range. November 2023, we put out a press release talking about the timber sale, talking about how we're working with the Forest Service and UVM on how we're doing adaptive silviculture, thinking about climate, our climate-smart future. Didn't get picked up. Wasn't hot enough. It wasn't sensational enough. What bothers me most about all this is the lightning rod that's putting it's the public trust that it's eating away at that bothers me the most. I'm not sure about the other agencies here, but I know that the Division of Forest sent 27 people to this conference. The foresters that work on our team and the other staff that are involved in long-range management planning are true professionals that care deeply about this work and are always thinking about the future. I just want those within like FPR or State of Vermont Public Service, could you just raise your hand for a second? You are incredible. I know this is very heavy. We may have a few loud voices, but many, many people trust and care what you do, and I just want you to know I am one of your biggest fans. So what's the future? I expect we'll have more pressure on us. The conversations are happening in communities, they're happening in the media, and they're happening in the State House. We can look to Massachusetts to see what's coming at us. We are trying to up our game in FPR. For the first time, I've been in FPR 21 years. We have an outreach and education coordinator, which is great, but we can't do this alone. We need to have a voice together. We need together to lead the dialogue. This group right here, you are the conservation and forest management thought leaders. We need your voice with us in communities, speaking to the media, and at the State House. Policies are driven by those that show up. You have the knowledge. I I mean, I'm an urban forester, so I was always hitting the streets talking to people, and people tell me all the time, we go to the woods because we don't want to talk to people. We need you to talk to people. What deeply troubles me, why this all like really deeply troubles me, I am really confident in what we do, that we're doing it right, and what we do is for the future. The publication that was released at this conference is exactly what we need to be peddling. This showcases that the forestry community is thinking about our future, is thinking about the future forests, where we do conserve forests. We care that some forests are passively managed. Where? That matters. That we're expanding ecological forestry. And though, yes, we do want to reduce consumption. So that's my story. My call to action is for you to help out. This is not ending today. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for all you do. You all are my heroes. I learn from the forestry community every day.
Wow, time to do something, huh? I'm batting cleanup here, and hopefully I don't do what I did when I used to play baseball, not for too many sports metaphors, but that would be strike out when I came up. So I'm going to talk about something a bit different. It's really a private land issue. And some of you are aware of what's gone on the Connecticut Lakes headwaters property, which is the tip of northern New Hampshire. And backing up, I guess I shouldn't assume that you all know who I am. I'm Charlie Levesque. I have a 30-year-old consulting firm, Innovative Natural Resource Solutions. We have offices in New Hampshire and in Maine. And our company works in forestry, sustainability. We work in forest products industry, economic development, and lately, especially in carbon. This is a carbon story. So the Connecticut Lake situation really began quite a few years ago. Who's heard of this, what's going on there? Okay, it's been out there a fair amount, absolutely. This doesn't seem to be advancing. You know why? Yeah? Okay. So, but it's not advancing that way. Okay. All right. That is working. Okay. I had a slide up there about securing Northeast forest carbon. It's a carbon story. I have a booth out there. Come and see me, talk to me about that. So here's the property in northern New Hampshire. It's the tip of the state. To the left or west is Quebec. To the right is Maine. If you've been there, you know that it's a substantial piece of ground. That town is the biggest town geographically in the state of New Hampshire, the town of Pittsburgh. It's also in Stewartstown and also in Clarksville. So this thing is working backwards. Now I got it. Just go backwards. So here's a little history of this property. In 2001, the Trust for Public Land optioned the property from International Paper. And prior to that, from 1984 to 1999, Champion International owned this property. And prior to that, St. Regis, Joe, 100 years before that, St. Regis was around for a long time owning this property. And so International Paper bought it from Champion International in 1999 and only owned it for a few years. And so Trust for Public Land stepped in to at least provide a time frame for protecting the property. So here's what ended up happening after a couple of years. 146,400 acres went to a private landowner who purchased it. The Connecticut Lakes Realty Trust, which is was a company of Lime Timber, was the owner starting in 2003. Now, a forest legacy conservation easement was placed on the property when that happened. A very unique one because of some things that happened associated with the property. Lime Timber really didn't want to manage public recreation on that property, and so most of the public, or most of the gravel road system, the main haul roads especially, about 269 miles, ended up under the state of New Hampshire ownership, the fee ownership. So fairly unique in a private piece of land with a conservation easement. The kind of winter roads and some side roads and so forth are still owned by the private landowner. 25,000 acres of the original land went to the state of New Hampshire to protect highly sensitive natural areas. And about 100 acres also was conveyed to the state of New Hampshire to expand a campground in the northern part of the property. Ultimately, it was a forest legacy easement. About $24 million of public money went into a $45 million project. Kind of a big deal project. So what's the issue? The issue is concerned today about lost timber supply and jobs as a result of carbon sales instead of timber sales. So I'll talk a little bit about how that's happened. So in New Hampshire, approximately 200,000 acres are under forest carbon contracts, under forest carbon credit projects. 146,400 acres of that is the Connecticut Lakes property. So it's not a lot of the state. And more importantly, it's not growing in any great way. So, you know, the bulk of the projects in New Hampshire is, was really on this one property. And no other properties of any size like this have carbon projects on them in New Hampshire. There are a number of them this size or bigger in Maine and also in the Adirondacks in New York. So what's going on? So from 2003 to 2009, Lime Timber owned the property. They were mandated by the easement, and the property's been under FSC certification since the beginning. 2009 and 2022, the Forest Land Group was the fee landowner on that property. In 2013, TFG sold carbon on the property through the California compliance market, 100-year contract. Most of the local folks had no idea that that had happened, and they only really found out that it happened really starting in 2022. So when that sale happened for the standing carbon, TFG got over $30 million in a block payment right up front. And over time, the income has been roughly in the $1 to $3 million a year range from net growth on the property. Each year after the carbon project under TFG ownership, substantial amount of timber has been sold. In 2022, Blue Source, now called Aurora Sustainable Lands, purchased the property, took over all of TFG lands in the country. In 2023, Aurora made an announcement that they were going to be reducing timber harvesting by about 60% in lieu of selling more forest carbon from that growth annually on the property. Here are the ownerships that now are under Aurora Sustainable Lands. They own about 1.7 million acres in the eastern United States, and you can see the Connecticut Lakes property at the top in New Hampshire. So as a result of these statements by the company, 3 pieces of legislation were filed in the New Hampshire legislature. One to put a moratorium on selling carbon for everybody, no more selling carbon. Another one to tax it. And another one that was focused, on kind of the local effects associated with it. It's all been boiled down into one at this point. It's looking like a bill will come out of the legislature that will be essentially a study committee or some kind of committee that will look at these issues as a whole. It hasn't passed the Senate yet, so we'll see what ends up happening. Aurora is required, when there's a change under the forest legacy easement, to update its forest management plan and cutting plan because they've made changes from the previous manager. And they have submitted those documents to the New Hampshire Division of Forest and Lands, and that is where they sit at this time. And it's up to the Division of Forest and Lands under the easement to approve or not approve those plans. So that has yet to happen. It could happen in the next month. We shall see where that turns out. There have been questions that have come up about whether or not there are violations of the conservation easement by this owner and maybe even the previous one. that's probably going to get a lot more clear in the next month or two. So I've got a few graphs here to show kind of what's happened and why the controversy is significant. This is a graph showing the timber harvest levels since the forest legacy easement, since Lime Timber bought it in 2003, to basically the present. And, you know, on this you can see prior to the carbon project in 2013, the harvest levels averaged around 40,000 cords a year. Net growth has been anywhere from 45,000 to 50,000 cords. There are managers here and they know the exact numbers, but it's in that range. After the carbon project sold, they reduced harvest levels somewhat, they meaning the forest land group, but during that time period, it was still at about 30,000 cords a year. Substantial, in fact, probably nobody outside of maybe timber harvesting company or two knew that levels got reduced. It was not significant enough to cause an uproar. And only when Aurora, then Blue Source, bought the property and made this pronouncement that they were going to reduce it to what that yellow graph shows there, to quite a bit less than what has been historically occurring on that property, did anybody get upset about it. And people are upset, and this issue is not resolved yet. So just understand, you know, what goes on in a carbon project like this and what Aurora is doing. So as I mentioned, when the project occurred in 2013, the Forest Land Group was able to sell the standing carbon on the property, and their requirement is to maintain that amount for the life of that 100-year contract, at minimum. Additionally, because annual net growth obviously is substantial on a property this size, they can sell carbon out of that annual net growth. They can cut timber out of that annual net growth, or they can do both of those or nothing. They have options on all those fronts. And what has changed is that Forest Land Group maintained a substantial program to cut timber, and that has changed in a major way. So this is far from resolved, and that really is kind of the end of the story today. And so I'm going to ask the speakers to come up and sit at the chairs here. I'm going to ask Woody to take one of the mobile mics. Would somebody over there run a mic around for us, because there are two mobile mics here, so that we can do a substantial block of time for Q&A. We've got all the way to 11:30. Why don't you sit wherever, just sit there, and when you get questions, well, I'm going to ask you to come up and use this mic, right, so you get it on camera and we get it recorded. Thank you, Dawn. Okay. Questions. We've got quite a bit of time. These are very controversial projects and really important ones, so hopefully you've got some good dialogue. In the back. Wait for the microphone, please. And, you know, if you can direct your question to an individual up here, that would be helpful.
I'm sorry, what did I
say? What I didn't say was I want you to introduce yourself first,
okay.
and then if your question is for a specific individual, please direct it that way, and they'll answer.
My name's Russ Wilmot. I'm a watershed forester in Massachusetts. And my question is it's actually not for anyone on the panel there. It's for Zach Porter. I really...
No, we're not going to do that. Okay, we're going to stick to...
I have a very respectful question.
No, we're going to stick to the panel, and I'm going to ask you to have a conversation with Zach yourself. You can do it out in the hall now or later, but I don't want to go there. That's not what we're doing in this panel. So give the mic back if that's what you got for a question. We got a question up front here, Bob? Yeah.
Hi, Bob Seymour. Charlie, about this carbon deal, is the reason they're cutting down on the harvest because they're worried about, because somebody made a miscalculation of the growth-harvest balance, or are they seeing higher prices for the carbon? To me, this is just a free market transaction, right? And I'm also curious, why would that be a violation of the easement or the legacy?
Yeah, I did not say it was a violation of the easement.
Well, people have...
There may be other issues that are violations. So here's how it goes, and I probably should have told the story more deeply. I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for Q&A. So the Forest Land Group owned and managed it for quite a while, as did Lime Timber, and their focus as companies was very consistent with what the easement intended to do. I was part of a big group of people that pulled this project together, and when we wrote that easement, finishing it in late 2002 into 2003, it was structured in such a way that left only two economic options for the private landowner part of that land. One was to grow timber perpetually on that property to supply the forest products industry. A minor income stream is from lease camp sites on the property, about 120 on the property. The intent was that this was a property that was going to be managed for sustainable forestry actively as a working force forever. That's what we intended. We messed up. We did not anticipate that there would be real carbon markets existing because they didn't exist in 2002. The easement is silent on that issue. So the issues that I mentioned, there may be some violations. It hasn't been proven yet. It's not about that issue, because you are right. The way that it's written, it is a business decision. When Blue Source, now Aurora Sustainable Lands, formed its fund, this is like the TIMOs that have come together. They marketed the fundraising for that fund. I understand $500 million or somewhere in that category to go out and buy timberlands. The marketing was that they were going to grow carbon and not timber, right? So their investors put money in to purchase these lands for the express purposes having the number one sort of business plan income stream come from carbon and not timber. So it's a business decision that this entity met. And again, the easement is silent around that issue, so you may be right. They may have every right to do what they're doing, but there's some issues that are outstanding that probably, I'm guessing some stuff will end up in court. We don't know yet.
Fascinating.
Don, you get that one?
Hello, my name is Graham Leitner, and I don't really have a question. It's more of a comment. I live on Camel's Hump Road, and I'm a consulting forester, and I'm a logging contractor. And I went to go see the timber sale that was, the research timber sale that was put up for sale in December. I bid on it. I didn't win the bid, but I was hired by the person who did win the bid to do some trucking off of that job. And we received quite a bit of pushback in the initial days when we started hauling just a couple loads of wood off of that job, and it was really from one individual up on the road, actually one of the people who was party to the lawsuit against the state. And it was just personal experience. I mean, that's my community, it's my neighborhood, and it really didn't feel very good to me that my neighbors, would call me out on doing my job and hauling some wood off of a state timber sale that was well sanctioned and well thought out. But I just want to say that I did respond to some of the comments on a neighborhood forum, tried to tell the story, tried to tell our story, and the only comments I received were very positive from my neighbors. So my point is that I think that the pushback that we're seeing in Vermont about timber harvesting in particular, it is really about telling our story and getting our story out there, because when we do tell our story, people tend to listen. I also shared the video that FPR put out, the YouTube video that came out recently. I shared that with my neighborhood, and I also received a lot of positive comments on that. So I think the support is there. I think the message is that we need to tell our story better, and people will listen.
Do you have a question for Danny?
No question, just
all right,
a comment.
Thank you. It was a comment. Okay, very good. Questions? How about over here? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Shaylee Hoover, and if you know me, you know I've been working in forest carbon for, yikes, a little over 20 years. So first I'm going to hop on my soapbox really quick, and then I have a question. I want to give my I Liked Your Story card to Danny. If anyone heard my talk yesterday, did you see what she did there? I advise people to share your forest story, to wear your heart on your sleeve. We all want healthy, resilient forests. That's why we're in this business. We love this ecosystem. And she talked about that. You could see that she cared. And forests have superpowers, right? So many values. It's not just timber. Carbon is one little aspect: clean water, clean air, recreation. Forests do a ton for us. And so that's one of my soapboxes. It's the power of and. Forests have the power of and we need to communicate that. My other soapbox is stocks and rates, right? It's not just carbon on the stump. Most people in here
And you have
probably...
a question that's coming.
I'll
right?
get there. Most people probably have a retirement portfolio, right? It's probably not just in your savings account. It's probably not just in stocks. Young forests and old forests do some different things in terms of carbon. So with that said, my question is for Jay, and it's about context. So telephone gap, 8,200 acres,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yep.
So what's the area of the ranger district that's on?
Oh,
Ish.
yeah. I'm gonna tell you the size of the Green Mountain National Forest. It's about
Okay, that was my next question.
410,000 acres. The Middlebury and Rochester Ranger District, which we call the north half, is actually a lot less than half of that. It's about 125,000 or so acres.
So what's that proportion of that project then? How many decimal points do you need on that percentage?
You're asking me to do some math on
No.
the top of my head?
So that's one of the things, is just to keep that context, that this is such a teeny tiny proportion of that overall area. And that sometimes gets lost in the discussion.
Yep. Point well taken.
Other questions, right? No, I'd encourage you all. You have great stories to tell, but maybe you should be presenting. And I encourage you to get up, on a panel and present. But we have people who spend a lot of time preparing to be here, and hopefully we've got questions for the folks who are up there. Julie.
Hi, Julie Evans from New Hampshire. I have a question for Chris Egan. Chris, thank you for being here today. We appreciate learning the details of what's been happening in Massachusetts. My question is, has the Alliance or anyone else been able to capture the stories and the data related to the logger families who have been impacted by the moratorium on public land logging?
Yeah, we've tried to do that, particularly with the state. I think that they didn't really understand that. The state projects tend to be large. That means they tend to be the mechanized harvesters who work on those. And so for some of because the projects tend to be on the larger side, for some of the mechanized harvesters, work on state lands was 30% of their business. So to have that gone away for, I think we're approaching our 17th month now. Some of them did have projects that were underway that they were allowed to continue, but yeah, it's a major impact, and we've pointed that out to the state. We've pointed out a decline in licensed timber harvesters in the state. We've pointed to members retiring early. We've pointed to members relocating to other parts of the country where the business climate was better. So I think, and we've been told by state officials that a lot of that information we shared was eye-opening to them. So I think that is important to get that across to people because I think it does have an impact, and we're trying to get those stories told. We're also trying to get our timber harvester and forester members onto panels and groups that are working on these issues so that their voice is heard, and we've had some success doing that. But yeah, that's absolutely a great point and something that we're certainly trying to do.
Other questions? Oh, yeah, run up, yep, sorry. Having trouble with the lights here there.
Hi, Christine McGowan with Vermont, and I guess this question is for each of the panelists. If you could sum up, as you think about the future of the forest area that you're talking about, what would be the consequence from a forest health ecological standpoint if these forests, if the opposition to any kind of timber harvesting were to win the day and you weren't allowed to do any kind of management? What would be the consequence from an ecological or forest health standpoint, in your opinion?
Thanks for the zinger, Christine. I'm reflecting on the Worcester Range management plan, and I think 13 harvests, Jim, is that how many are in there? You know, I'm just going to share a little bit about like how we presented the information, and then talk about how we could do more to tell why we're doing it. We present the information in the plan, and like you look at the plan, and you show just like these are the areas, and it looks like you're just going to clear cut, right? That's the perception. And then we don't go into the why. And in many cases, our foresters have gone out there and identified because of previous management. It's all even age. They wanted to add diversity and complexity into it. And we need to tell that story a little bit more. So a lot of times we're going in there, we're doing restorative work. But even beyond that, a lot of times we need forests, right? The forests don't always need us. In some cases, we're trying to restore. Long term, I'm sure they'd be okay, but we are here, we need forests. We have the opportunity to restore them, to add that diversity, add the complexity, build that resilience for the future, and at the same time, wood is in every part of our lives, and it does support communities. So there's many reasons for it. Probably we could walk away, but we're gonna lose a lot of benefits for that, including habitat and including a whole bunch of other stuff associated with it. I don't know if that's the best answer, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah, that was a great question. I think the first thing to point out is that the Green Mountain National Forest, which is about 410,000 acres, about 35 to 40% of those acres are off limits to timber harvesting altogether. And there's other areas where harvesting is limited because of other resource concerns and focus of those management emphasis areas that I pointed out during my presentation. But the areas that we are able to actively manage, it's pretty evident and clear that most of the forests on the Green Mountain National Forest, which is similar to the rest of the state, is a recovery forest. Basically, it's secondary forests that have recovered from the last century's land clearing escapades of the early 20th century, right? And so most of the forests have come back as northern hardwood forests. And we all know as foresters that's not the natural composition that existed pre-European settlement. And so just the health from a perspective of composition and the mosaic of age classes is not the desire of what we think is needed to provide for that healthy, biodiverse habitat that we think is necessary to sustain wildlife and plant species across that landscape. But other stressors are totally like playing into the picture. Insect and disease is obviously one of the biggest concerns. Beech bark disease is prevalent across the forest. We know emerald ash borer is going to make a big impact. And we're trying to stay ahead of that by enabling ourselves to actively manage and provide for a more resilient forest ecosystem that would be able to withstand those types of stressors where under completely untouched natural conditions, perhaps they would not. So we will definitely be able to see the difference between what we're not managing versus what we're trying to manage, and see, if all that plays true or not.
Just quickly, we're seeing this in Massachusetts. Just to be clear, our organization supports a mix of reserves and sustainably managed forest, but the reserves have to be in the right place. It makes little sense to put a reserve in an area that's really vulnerable, whether it's already from invasive insects or other diseases, and pretend that that's going to lead to not only a forest carbon gain, but and some kind of ecological gain. So, in Massachusetts, we have a continuous forest inventory that's being done very similar to the FIA that's shown that in some of the managed areas are actually ahead in carbon sequestration rate and carbon storage compared to some of the areas of reserves that have been hit hard by some of these issues. So, it's important to look at site vulnerability and consider that when we're deciding where to put reserves, and that just makes sense. So,
I do want to touch on it for the Connecticut Lakes property a little bit, a little different than these public pieces of land, but when the project happened, that 25,000 acres that went to the state of New Hampshire managed by New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, the intent was the focus there is natural areas. So, you know, that part of the management scheme, it was intended to happen on public land, not on the private land that has been owned by 3 owners. So on the private land, and I'm really going to kind of share what we heard at some of the hearings on these pieces of legislation on the project. People both from consumptive hunters and also from non-consumptive biology backgrounds said that, you know, we're going to lose early successional habitat on the property. It's one of the things that property provides. And anybody hunted ruffed grouse on that property? Because it's got ruffed grouse everywhere, and it won't in a time period if the harvest levels go down. I will say that those of you who know how Champion International managed that property back in the 1990s, it was cut very hard for quite a few years. And so it is recovering from that, but there is concern that that early successional habitat, which doesn't exist in any great acreage in a lot of these areas, is going to get lost from this property, and the ecological values associated with that will get lost. So other questions? We have time for a few more. There's one over here, Woody.
Hey there. Thank you guys for this presentation. It's been great. I've learned a lot. I'm Abby Heggenstaller. I work in the White Mountain National Forest. And this question might be more for Jay, but it's probably relevant to the other folks as well. You know, when we're making our management decisions, we're using the best available science. And that's basically, you know, we're using peer-reviewed sources, well-cited, et cetera. But folks who are opposing our decisions also have their own science. So when you're communicating with folks who, they have their science, we have their science, how do you bridge that gap when it's like, well, we both think that we're right, you know? Like, how can you basically cite your sources, I guess? Thank you.
No, that's a really great question. Conflicting scientific literature to make a point on one side of an issue or another has always been part of our environmental analysis process, at least on federal lands, on the Forest Service with National Forest lands. And it's just an inherent part of the process. Oftentimes literature, scientific literature, isn't peer-reviewed and is actually presented that way. Sometimes opinion pieces actually are presented as scientific literature, peer-reviewed scientific literature, when it's really not. And it's important to point that out to those who are using those types of sources to make their perspective known to us. We try to do our best. I think we do a really good job of citing the best available science, the latest that we can. If new information is presented to us, we review that and determine if it changes any of our perspectives, and sometimes it does. I guess it's just important to understand that sometimes we just have to agree to disagree. There's always going to be controversy and contention in dueling literature, basically, that is being used. And I think also sometimes scientific literature, maybe from both sides of the story, can sometimes be cherry-picked and really isn't applicable to the issue at hand. Citing literature where research has been done in New Zealand, for instance, and trying to apply that to silvicultural methods or ecological effects in New England may not be very applicable. Sometimes it could be. So, you know, we have a very robust staff of really good, smart specialists and scientists in their fields who can vet the literature to determine whether it's applicable and is being used in a correct way when it's presented to us, when it's in direct contention or contradiction to the way that we see the literature to apply towards what we're trying to disclose as far as environmental effects to resources from our proposed management activities. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. It's just an ongoing issue that's never going to go away. You just got to keep on top of it.
Thank you, Jay. So, 2 more questions. Carl, you're next. If there's another one, that'll be the last one, probably right here. Go ahead, Carl.
Okay, Danny, this one's for you. First of all, if I could give an Academy Award to a state forester, I would give it to you for your talk today. I'm Carl Honkin, and I'm a watershed forester with USDA Forest Service, State, Private, and Tribal Forestry. And I wanted to ask you a question regarding some pending legislation in Vermont, which I just pulled up on Vermont Public. What this legislation does, and it's related to both of your topics on Camel's Hump and the Worcester Range, and it says that it's part of a $5 million proposal. Lawmakers want to study the economic impact of forest products in Vermont and the industry's workforce needs. They also want to pay loggers, listen to this, folks, pay loggers to comply with state regulations intended to protect water quality and climate resilience. Could you speak to that pending legislation, please?
Sure. So it's been updated since then. Things move daily. This was an initiative that was put forward by Representative Sims and Representative Levesque that are really strong advocates and proponents for working forests, with particular interest in supporting our logging community, as all of you know, have been suffering from business interruption with the weather, not being able to get in the winter and wet summers, and really at a point now, and probably across the region, where we're seeing loggers leave the industry, which we break that piece of the supply chain, it's going to crush it all along. So support for, this was put forward really in working with the professional logging contractors of the Northeast. It's expanded from Maine. Right now, currently, it's in the appropriations bill for $1 million to support practices for loggers, climate resilience, and water quality practices, recognizing that if we build up a little bit strong, like AMPs on steroids, they can get out more often during these, get in there quicker after these wet events. So I think that to me, it's a very, very tight budget year, and to have $1 million to support our logging community is huge right now. And they're recognizing that agriculture has received a lot of assistance for BMPs over the years, and starting to recognize that our forestry community loggers need it as well. Actually, it would be great if I could even share the link during the appropriations discussion, heads nodding saying we support loggers.
Thank you, Danny. Last question, right here, Don.
Hi, I'm Ginger Anderson, and I'm retired. This question is for Jay, and I want to make sure that I understood something that you showed on your slides. It looked to me as though forest planning, at least on the Green Mountain, but maybe nationwide, is now going to have to account for carbon emissions from harvesting. And my question is, did I understand that correctly from your visual? And if that's the case, are you also going to be looking at some way to quantify carbon emissions from, say, recreation, the vehicles that are in your parking lot for hiking trails or hunters or whatever? What is this quantification of carbon emissions that I saw on that visual?
Yeah,
Thanks.
good question. Good to see you, Ginger. Yeah, so the Council on Environmental Quality, the guidance that I was mentioning in my slide regarding greenhouse gas emissions associated with climate change, the relationship with climate change, is just guidance. But it's strong guidance from the very council that's responsible for overseeing the NEPA process on all federally managed land. So even though it's guidance, it's used more closely to regulation. That guidance itself calls for quantification of fossil fuel emissions primarily. That is a requirement, or close to a requirement, as close as a guideline can be. On the biogenic side, it's optional for vegetative-related management projects. Any type of vegetative management, primarily tree-related harvesting of trees. it leaves the option to the discretion of the responsible official for a particular project. So part of the basis for that decision-making process for that person is directly related to the amount of public concern related to that issue. So for Telephone Gap, I mentioned there was a tremendous amount of input from the public out of those 1,600 comments that we received, specific to the quantification of carbon from harvesting trees. So based on that fact alone, our deciding official for this project decided it was the best way to go to try to quantify the best that we could the direct emissions of carbon from harvesting trees. And our Office of Sustainability and Climate, which is staffed by some tremendously smart people in our Washington office, staffed with carbon scientists and specialists in the area of carbon management, spent hours and hours trying to use the best modeling and best available science to be able to come up with a good, replicable way so this can be replicable across any national forest project in the country, or anywhere for that matter, to be able to quantify with a pretty good feel for accuracy on how much carbon is going to be emitted, considering harvested woody products and the storage of carbon in wood and the decomposition of that wood over time as soon as it goes into the landfill, and the inefficiencies of the sawmill from the saw kerf, and the residual slash that's left on the logging site. All of that is taken into consideration when they came up with those numbers. And it was really important for us to be clear that this is not precedent setting for other forests to repeat, unless they themselves came to the same determination that the public input on that particular project really called for that quantification. It was really important for us to put it into context, because you just throw a carbon emission number out there, like I mentioned, 170,000 metric tons of carbon. It sounds like a lot, and it is. You break it down into an annual chunk and you put it into context, it's the same amount of carbon that's emitted by 2,700 passenger vehicles driving around in a year. Even a better context, in 2017 alone, in Vermont alone, the amount of cars that were driven in that year emitted 2.5 million metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere. That's the same amount of carbon that 550,000 passenger vehicles emit. And so then it starts to put that 170,000 metric tons from that timber component of that project really into perspective. The thing that I don't know if I even mentioned was that in that same slide, the carbon that's being sequestered by the rest of the national forest, just in the Green Mountain National Forest, will recover that carbon lost in 2 to 3.5 months. So that's another important context to point out. So anyway.
A new day. Can you join me in thanking our speakers here? We are done. Lunch is downstairs in the banquet hall where you get your breakfast. We'll see you there.